By the end of 1914, the war that was supposed to be over by Christmas had settled into a grim and bloody stalemate. The front lines in France and Belgium had solidified into a network of trenches that stretched for hundreds of miles, from the North Sea to the Swiss border. The soldiers who had marched off to war with such enthusiasm and patriotism now found themselves trapped in a nightmarish world of mud, blood, and death. The trenches were a far cry from the glorious battlefields that the soldiers had imagined. They were narrow, muddy ditches, often filled with water and infested with rats. The walls were reinforced with sandbags and wooden planks, but they offered little protection from the constant shelling and sniper fire. The soldiers lived in these trenches for weeks, even months, at a time, enduring conditions that were almost unimaginable. The daily routine in the trenches was a monotonous cycle of boredom and terror. The soldiers spent their days repairing the trenches, standing watch, and trying to stay dry. At night, they ventured out into no man's land, the deadly strip of ground between the opposing trenches, to lay barbed wire, repair defenses, or launch raids on the enemy. The constant threat of death was ever present, and the soldiers lived in a state of perpetual fear. The trenches were also a breeding ground for disease. The unsanitary conditions, combined with the constant exposure to the elements, led to outbreaks of dysentery, typhus, and trench foot, a painful condition caused by prolonged exposure to wet and cold. Medical supplies were scarce, and the wounded often had to wait hours, even days, before they could be evacuated to a field hospital. But the greatest horror of the trenches was the constant shelling. The artillery barrages could last for hours, even days, and the soldiers had no way to escape the relentless bombardment. The shells tore apart the trenches, burying men alive and turning the battlefield into a cratered wasteland. The noise was deafening, and the psychological toll was immense. Many soldiers suffered from shell shock, a condition that left them unable to function, haunted by the horrors they had witnessed. Despite the unimaginable conditions, the soldiers in the trenches found ways to cope. They formed close bonds with their comrades, relying on each other for support and survival. They found solace in small comforts: letters from home, a shared cigarette, a moment of laughter in the midst of the chaos. But the camaraderie and resilience of the soldiers could not mask the grim reality of their situation. The war had become a brutal and senseless slaughter, and there was no end in sight. The stalemate on the Western Front was mirrored by similar deadlocks on other fronts. In the east, the Russian and Austro-Hungarian armies were locked in a brutal struggle that stretched from the Baltic Sea to the Carpathian Mountains. The Russian army, though vast in numbers, was poorly equipped and led, and it suffered heavy losses in its attempts to break through the Austro-Hungarian lines. The Austro-Hungarian army, though more experienced, was also stretched thin, and it struggled to hold the line against the Russian onslaught. In the Balkans, the war had become a chaotic and bloody conflict, with multiple factions vying for control. Serbia, though outnumbered and outgunned, managed to hold off the Austro-Hungarian army in a series of fierce battles. But the cost was high, and the Serbian army was eventually forced to retreat, leaving its homeland in the hands of the invaders. In the Middle East, the Ottoman Empire had entered the war on the side of the Central Powers, and its armies were engaged in a brutal struggle against the British and their allies. The Ottoman Empire, though in decline, was still a formidable force, and its armies fought with determination and ferocity. The British, though better equipped and led, faced a difficult and costly campaign in the harsh and unforgiving terrain of the Middle East. As the war dragged on, the toll on the soldiers and civilians alike became increasingly unbearable. The initial enthusiasm and patriotism that had marked the beginning of the war had long since faded, replaced by a grim determination to survive. The soldiers in the trenches, though weary and disillusioned, continued to fight, driven by a sense of duty and a desire to protect their comrades. But the war was far from over, and the worst was yet to come. The introduction of new weapons and tactics, such as poison gas, tanks, and aerial bombardment, would only increase the scale and intensity of the slaughter. The trenches of hell would become even more deadly, and the soldiers who fought in them would face even greater horrors. As the year 1915 dawned, the world was still in the grip of the Great War. The trenches of the Western Front had become a symbol of the senseless brutality and futility of the conflict. The soldiers who fought in them were caught in a nightmare from which there seemed to be no escape. But the war was far from over, and the story of the First World War was far from finished. To be continued. While the Western Front had descended into a grim stalemate, the war on the Eastern Front and in other theaters continued to rage with a ferocity that matched, and often surpassed, the horrors of the trenches. The Eastern Front, stretching from the Baltic Sea to the Carpathian Mountains, was a vast and brutal battlefield where the Russian Empire clashed with the Central Powers Germany and Austria-Hungary. Meanwhile, in the Mediterranean, a daring and ill-fated campaign unfolded at Gallipoli, as the Allies sought to break the deadlock and strike a decisive blow against the Ottoman Empire. The Eastern Front, a war of movement and desperation. The Eastern Front was a stark contrast to the static trench warfare of the West. Here, the vast expanses of land allowed for more fluid and mobile warfare, but the scale of the fighting was no less devastating. The Russian Empire, with its seemingly endless reserves of manpower, faced off against the more technologically advanced and better organized armies of Germany and Austria-Hungary. In the early months of the war, the Russian army launched a massive offensive into East Prussia, hoping to relieve pressure on their French allies in the west. The Russian steamroller, as it was called, advanced with surprising speed, catching the Germans off guard. However, the Russian army was plagued by poor leadership, inadequate supplies, and a lack of coordination. At the Battle of Tannenberg in August 1914, the German Eighth Army, led by Generals Paul von Hindenburg and Erich Ludendorff, encircled and annihilated the Russian Second Army. The defeat was catastrophic for the Russians, with over 100,000 men killed, wounded, or captured. Despite this setback, the Russians continued to press their offensive in Galicia, a region of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. The Austro-Hungarian army, already strained by the demands of the war, was no match for the Russian onslaught. By the end of 1914, the Russians had captured much of Galicia, including the city of Lemberg, modern-day Lviv. However, the cost was immense, and the Russian army was stretched to its limits. As the war dragged on, the Eastern Front became a theater of unimaginable suffering. The Russian soldiers, often poorly equipped and inadequately supplied, faced the harsh realities of war in a land of bitter cold and endless mud. The civilian population bore the brunt of the fighting, as entire villages were destroyed and millions were displaced. The war on the Eastern Front was a war of attrition, with neither side able to deliver a decisive blow. The Gallipoli campaign, a bold gamble and a costly failure. While the Eastern Front consumed the attention of the Central Powers, the Allies sought to open a new front in the Mediterranean. The goal was to knock the Ottoman Empire out of the war and secure a sea route to Russia, which was increasingly isolated from its allies. The plan, championed by British First Lord of the Admiralty Winston Churchill, called for a naval and amphibious assault on the Gallipoli Peninsula, a narrow strip of land guarding the entrance to the Dardanelles Strait. In February 1915, the Allied fleet began its bombardment of Ottoman fortifications along the Dardanelles. However, the naval campaign quickly ran into trouble. The Ottoman defenses, bolstered by German advisors, proved more resilient than expected. Mines laid in the strait sank several Allied ships, and the fleet was forced to withdraw. Undeterred, the Allies decided to launch a ground invasion of the Gallipoli Peninsula. On April 25, 1915, British, French, Australian, and New Zealand troops landed on the beaches of Gallipoli. The landings were chaotic and poorly coordinated, and the Allied forces were met with fierce resistance from the Ottoman defenders, led by the brilliant commander Mustafa Kemal, later known as Ataturk. The fighting at Gallipoli was some of the most brutal of the war. The Allied troops, many of them young and inexperienced, found themselves pinned down on narrow beaches, exposed to relentless Ottoman fire from the cliffs above. The terrain was rugged and unforgiving, and the heat and disease took a heavy toll. Despite repeated attempts to break through the Ottoman lines, the Allies were unable to gain a foothold. The campaign quickly descended into a stalemate, reminiscent of the trenches on the Western Front. The soldiers on both sides endured unimaginable hardships, as they fought in the scorching heat of summer and the freezing cold of winter. The Allied forces, though brave and determined, were unable to overcome the tenacity of the Ottoman defenders. By the end of 1915, it was clear that the Gallipoli campaign had failed. In December, the Allies began a carefully planned evacuation, withdrawing their forces under the cover of darkness. The evacuation was one of the few successful operations of the campaign, but it could not mask the scale of the disaster. The Allies had suffered over 250,000 casualties, including more than 44,000 dead. The Ottoman Empire, though victorious, had also paid a heavy price, with over 250,000 casualties of its own. The human cost. The Eastern Front and the Gallipoli campaign were stark reminders of the human cost of the war. On the Eastern Front, the Russian army, though vast, was slowly being bled dry. The soldiers, many of them peasants conscripted from the countryside, fought with courage and determination, but they were no match for the superior tactics and technology of the Germans. The civilian population, caught in the crossfire, suffered immensely, as entire regions were devastated by the fighting. At Gallipoli, the campaign was a tragic waste of life and resources. The young men who fought and died on the beaches and cliffs of the peninsula were remembered as heroes, but their sacrifice did little to advance the Allied cause. The failure at Gallipoli was a blow to Allied morale, and it marked the end of Winston Churchill's political career for a time. As the year 1915 drew to a close, the war showed no signs of ending. The Eastern Front remained a brutal and bloody battleground, while the Gallipoli campaign had ended in failure. The soldiers on both sides continued to endure unimaginable hardships, and the civilian populations of Europe and beyond bore the brunt of the conflict. The war had become a global tragedy, and the worst was yet to come. To be continued.